In the heart of Kazakhstan's political elite, a horrifying tragedy unfolded that sent shockwaves across the nation and far beyond its borders. Kuandyk Bishimbayev, a former minister of national economy, once lauded for his meteoric rise to power, now stands as the central figure in a dark and chilling story: the brutal and prolonged death of his wife, Saltanat Nukenova, a bright and independent woman silenced too soon. This case has captivated global attention, not only for its violence, but also for what it reveals about unchecked power, systemic corruption, and the devastating impacts of domestic violence. From the painstaking investigation to the dramatic courtroom revelations, the world watched as the layers of this story were peeled back, exposing secrets that many hoped would remain hidden. Today, we delve deep into the events that led to Saltanat's tragic end, the investigation that unraveled the truth, and the verdict that followed. How did a man with so much influence think he could escape justice? And what does this case mean for victims of abuse who feel powerless in the shadow of privilege and connections? Stay with us as we unpack the chilling details of a crime that gripped the world. To understand the tragedy at the heart of this story, we must first look at the lives of the two individuals involved: Kuandyk Bishimbayev and Saltanat Nukenova, two people from vastly different backgrounds whose paths would intertwine with devastating consequences. Kuandyk Bishimbayev was born in 1980 into a family deeply entrenched in Kazakhstan's political and economic elite. As the eldest of two children, Kwand was raised in privilege. His mother, Alnurlibova, a shrewd entrepreneur, and his father, a parliamentarian, ensuring he had every advantage. Kwand's education was impeccable, earning a PhD in economic sciences and attending top institutions, including the prestigious George Washington University in the United States. His rapid rise to power mirrored his family's influence, culminating in his appointment as Minister of National Economy. But behind the polished facade was a man known for his manipulative tendencies, a history of corruption, and a knack for evading accountability, thanks to his deep-rooted connections. Saltanat Nukenova's story, on the other hand, couldn't be more different. Born in 1992 in Pavlodar, she was the youngest in a respected and close-knit family. Saltanat carved her own path, building a career as an astrologer, a field where she quickly gained recognition and a loyal following. Fiercely independent, she turned her passion into a thriving business, becoming a self-sufficient and successful young woman. Friends and family knew her as intelligent, driven, and deeply dedicated to her work and the life she had created for herself. Two contrasting lives, one of power and privilege, the other of self-made success, set the stage for a relationship that would begin with admiration but descend into a nightmare. How did these two lives collide, and what led to the tragic unraveling of their story? As we dig deeper, the answers reveal a disturbing dynamic fueled by control, manipulation, and unchecked aggression. The story of Kuandyk Bishimbayev and Saltanat Nukenova begins like something out of a novel, an influential and persistent suitor chasing after a bright and independent woman. But beneath the surface, dark patterns were emerging that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. Bishimbayev's pursuit of Saltanat started in 2022, when he discovered her social media presence and became captivated by her beauty and intellect. As an astrologer, Saltanat worked exclusively with female clients, a boundary Kwand ignored entirely. He bombarded her with requests for consultations, despite her repeated refusals. His obsession grew, and he began manipulating family ties to gain her trust, going as far as meeting her grandmother to seek her blessing, a gesture that touched Saltanat even as she remained wary of his intentions. Initially, Saltanat resisted his advances. She confided in friends and family that she felt no romantic connection to Kwand, citing their age difference and fundamental incompatibilities. But unexpectedly, her stance shifted. In the fall of 2022, Saltanat shocked her loved ones by announcing their engagement. Just months later, they celebrated a lavish wedding, an event that seemed like a fairy tale to outsiders. Friends and family cautiously embraced the union, hopeful that the couple could build a happy life together. However, this hope was short-lived. After the wedding, the dynamics of their relationship changed drastically. Kwand's behavior grew controlling, isolating Saltanat from her family and friends. He forced her to give up her thriving career, leaving her financially dependent and without the independence she had cherished. Subtle signs of trouble began to surface. Saltanat's once vibrant demeanor faded, and whispers of domestic tension began circulating among her closest friends. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Saltanat, once a symbol of independence and strength, became trapped in a cycle of control and abuse. How did a woman so strong and self-assured become ensnared in such a toxic relationship? These early events laid the foundation for the escalating violence that would ultimately claim her life. November 8th, 2023. It was a day that started like any other, but would soon unravel into one of the most shocking and brutal crimes to capture global attention. That evening, Kuandyk Bishimbayev and Saltanat Nukenova attended a concert featuring a famous performer, a seemingly normal outing for a married couple. However, even in the bustling concert hall, cracks in their relationship were on full display. Friends and witnesses later recounted the growing tension between the two, culminating in a heated argument that overshadowed the music and festivities. As the argument escalated, the couple abruptly left the concert without saying goodbye to anyone. They drove to a family-owned restaurant operated by Kwan's cousin, Saltanat. What followed inside that restaurant would forever change the lives of everyone connected to this case. At first, the couple secluded themselves in a private VIP booth where their argument continued. Surveillance footage recovered from the restaurant showed Kwan growing increasingly aggressive. Friends who saw the couple earlier at the concert described Saltanat as calm, yet visibly distressed, while Kwan appeared agitated and unrelenting. Inside the booth, tensions reached a boiling point. Wine and alcohol flowed, not as a way to ease tensions, but seemingly to fuel Kwan's aggression. As the night wore on, Saltanat made a desperate attempt to escape. Surveillance footage captured her stepping outside the restaurant, trying to distance herself from her husband. She even called her brother Ibek, telling him she intended to leave Kwan for good and come to his house. But before she could get far, Kwan caught up to her. Through a combination of coercion, manipulation, and threats, he convinced her to return inside, promising to talk things out. Reluctantly, Saltanat complied, a decision that would tragically lead to her final hours. Back inside the restaurant, the abuse escalated. The VIP booth offered privacy, shielding Kwan's actions from staff and other patrons. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline, revealing that over the next 6 to 8 hours, Saltanat was subjected to sustained and horrifying physical violence. Forensic reports would later show extensive injuries covering her body, broken bones, deep bruises, and lacerations, indicating prolonged and deliberate torture. Surveillance footage from the hallway captured unsettling moments. At one point, Saltanat locked herself in a bathroom, desperate to create a barrier between her and her husband. Kwan, undeterred, kicked down the door and forced her out. Witnesses heard muffled shouting, followed by sounds of objects breaking. One chilling sequence from the footage shows Kwan dragging Saltanat by her hair back into the booth, her resistance evident but futile against his strength and rage. By early morning, Saltanat's body was failing. Her injuries were catastrophic. Instead of calling for help, Kwan made an incomprehensible decision. He contacted a fortune teller, asking if his wife would recover. According to testimony, he sat in the booth with her unconscious body for hours, claiming he thought she was merely asleep. By the time emergency services were finally summoned, hours later, it was too late. Saltanat was already dead, her body cold and showing signs of rigor mortis. The aftermath inside the restaurant painted a gruesome picture. Bloodstains, broken furniture, and shattered glass told the story of a violent and prolonged assault. Kwan's cousin, Bakatan, later admitted to helping cover up the crime, including deleting CCTV footage in an attempt to erase evidence of what had happened. Fortunately, forensic experts were able to recover the files, providing investigators with key insights into the events of that horrific night. Saltanat's death was not an accident. It was the result of calculated, sustained abuse, hours of physical and psychological torment inflicted by the very man who had vowed to protect her. What could drive someone to such cruelty? How could a once independent and vibrant woman become the victim of such a heinous act? These questions haunt this case as the world reflects on the tragic fate of Saltanat Nukenova and the unchecked violence that ended her life. The tragic discovery of Saltanat Nukenova's death came in the most shocking and impersonal way. On the morning of November 9th, 2023, Saltanat's brother Ibek was scrolling through his phone when he received a frantic call from a relative. Social media was flooded with rumors and news articles claiming that Saltanat had been killed, allegedly at the hands of her husband, Kuandyk Bishimbayev. Stunned and disbelieving, Ibek immediately tried to contact his sister, but her phone was silent. Fearing the worst, he rushed to her home, only to find it empty. Kwand was also unreachable, and the details of what had transpired remained frustratingly unclear. Desperate for answers, Ibek drove to the restaurant where Saltanat had last been seen. There, a grim reality awaited him. Police officers on site confirmed the unthinkable. Saltanat was dead. What emerged in the following weeks was a harrowing tale pieced together through painstaking investigation. Surveillance footage from the restaurant played a crucial role. Though Kwand and his cousin, Bakatan Banov, had attempted to delete the recordings, forensic experts were able to recover the files. The footage revealed chilling glimpses of the abuse Saltanat endured that night. Scenes of her being dragged by her hair, forced into the booth, and visibly distressed as she tried to escape. The most damning evidence came from the post-mortem examination. Medical reports described extensive injuries covering nearly every part of Saltanat's body. Broken bones, deep bruising, and internal trauma pointed to prolonged and systematic torture over several hours. Forensic experts noted that many of the injuries had been inflicted hours before her death, suggesting a slow and deliberate escalation of violence. The investigation also uncovered Kwand's calculated efforts to cover up his crime. After realizing that Saltanat was dead, Kwand called his cousin Bakatan to help manage the situation. Together, they closed the restaurant, dismissed the staff, and worked to destroy evidence. Surveillance footage was erased, and Saltanat's belongings were removed in an attempt to stage the scene. However, investigators recovered enough of the data to reconstruct the horrific events. As details emerged, testimony from Saltanat's friends and family painted a heartbreaking picture of her final months. They described a once vibrant and self-sufficient woman reduced to a shadow of herself. Accounts of escalating abuse, isolation, and psychological manipulation provided context to the nightmarish end she faced. The evidence against Kwand was overwhelming, yet he maintained his innocence, blaming Saltanat for her injuries and insisting her death was a tragic accident. But the recovered footage and forensic findings told a very different story, one of control, cruelty, and a horrific abuse of power. Saltanat's death was not just a personal tragedy, it became a rallying cry for justice, exposing the systemic failures that allowed a powerful man to operate with impunity for so long. As the investigation unfolded, public outrage mounted, setting the stage for a trial that would demand accountability for her life and the suffering she endured. The path to justice for Saltanat Nukenova was fraught with challenges, manipulation, and deeply entrenched systemic corruption. From the moment Kuandyk Bishimbayev was arrested, it became clear that this case was not just about uncovering the truth, but about whether the justice system in Kazakhstan could hold a man of such power and influence accountable. Kwand's first move to tilt the odds in his favor was requesting a jury trial. This wasn't a random decision, it was a calculated strategy. In Kazakhstan's legal system, a life sentence in a jury trial requires a unanimous decision from all jurors and the presiding judge. By insisting on this route, Kwand banked on the slim likelihood of unanimity, hoping that his wealth and connections could sway at least one juror, effectively shielding him from the harshest possible sentence. But his tactics didn't stop there. Kwand's defense team launched an aggressive campaign to discredit Saltanat. In court, they painted her as an unstable, emotionally volatile alcoholic who had a history of provoking Kwand. His lawyers claimed her injuries were largely self-inflicted, accidents resulting from drunken falls, an argument that directly contradicted the overwhelming forensic evidence showing deliberate and sustained violence. This victim-blaming narrative not only sought to deflect blame, but also to tarnish Saltanat's character in the eyes of the court and the public. Behind the scenes, Kwand attempted to manipulate key witnesses, including his own cousin, Bakatan Banov. Bakatan, who had been complicit in destroying evidence, such as deleting CCTV footage from the restaurant, became a central figure in the trial. Kwand pressured him to provide false testimony, claiming the footage had been erased to protect Saltanat's dignity, as it allegedly showed her behaving inappropriately. However, under mounting pressure from investigators and the risk of harsher penalties, Bakatan turned against Kuandyk, revealing details of their attempt to cover up the crime. His testimony proved pivotal, exposing Kuandyk's calculated efforts to obscure the truth. While Kuandyk used every means to manipulate the system, the Nukenova family fought back with equal determination. Saltanat's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, became fierce advocates for transparency and justice. Her mother delivered an emotional statement during the trial, describing the unspeakable pain of losing her child and the horrific injuries that left her unable to say a proper goodbye to her daughter. "No mother should have to bury her child under such circumstances," she said tearfully, calling on the court to deliver a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime. Her father, a respected member of their community, echoed her sentiments. In interviews with local media, he expressed his hope that this trial would set a precedent for how domestic violence cases were handled in Kazakhstan. "This is not just about Saltanat," he said. "This is about every woman who suffers in silence, believing that no one will listen, that no one will fight for her." Their advocacy extended beyond the courtroom. The family demanded that the trial be open to the public, with full media coverage to ensure transparency. They feared that without public scrutiny, Kuandyk's wealth and influence would allow him to evade justice once again, as he had in the past. The family's efforts resonated with a public already outraged by the details of the case. Protests and social media campaigns demanded accountability, turning Saltanat's story into a rallying cry against domestic violence and corruption. International and local media added further pressure. Journalists highlighted Kuandyk's history of escaping accountability, his early release from a corruption sentence, and his unchecked rise to power, emphasizing how systemic privilege had shielded him for years. The case became a focal point for broader conversations about domestic violence and judicial reform in Kazakhstan, bringing unprecedented attention to the trial. In response to the mounting public outcry, the court took measures to ensure transparency. Jurors were carefully vetted, and the presiding judge committed to a fair and open process. Despite Kuandyk's attempts to smear Saltanat's reputation and manipulate the narrative, the recovered evidence and powerful testimonies from her family and friends painted a damning picture of abuse and control. This wasn't just a trial about one woman's tragic death. It was a test of whether a society could stand up to the systemic inequalities that allowed such tragedies to happen. In the face of manipulation and immense legal hurdles, the combined pressure of public outrage, media attention, and the unrelenting determination of Saltanat's family ensured that her story was heard and that justice in some measure would be served. On May 13, 2024, the trial of Kuandyk Bishimbayev reached its conclusion. The case had gripped the nation and drawn international attention, with the public and media watching closely to see whether justice would truly be served. The court delivered its verdict. Bishimbayev was found guilty of torture, grievous bodily harm, and the murder of his wife, Saltanat Nukenova. The sentence, 4 years in prison, a partial accumulation of terms for murder, battery, and torture. His cousin Bakatan Banov, who had aided in covering up the crime by destroying evidence, received 4 years in prison for complicity and obstruction. For some, the verdict was a relief. It marked a rare instance of a powerful figure being held accountable for his crimes in a system often criticized for corruption and leniency towards the elite. The conviction was hailed as a step forward for justice, particularly for victims of domestic violence. But for Saltanat's family, the outcome was bittersweet. Her father expressed deep disappointment in the court's decision, saying, "A life was taken in the most brutal way imaginable. Anything less than a life sentence is an insult to my daughter's memory." The Nukenova family had hoped that Kuandyk's history of corruption and violence, combined with the horrific nature of the crime, would result in the maximum penalty. Instead, the partial accumulation of sentences meant that Kuandyk could theoretically walk free in his old age. Saltanat's brother, Ibek, offered a more pragmatic perspective. While he shared his father's frustration, he noted that for the 44-year-old Kuandyk, a 24-year sentence could amount to a life sentence in practice. By the time he's released, he'll have lost the prime years of his life. He'll never regain the influence or power he once had. That's some measure of justice, but it will never bring my sister back. The trial also brought some semblance of accountability for Bakatan Banov, who received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation with investigators. While his actions in aiding the cover-up were inexcusable, his decision to turn against Kwand and reveal key evidence was instrumental in securing the conviction. Despite the verdict, the Nukenova family's dissatisfaction reflected a broader sentiment among the public. Many felt the punishment did not match the severity of the crime. The case had exposed glaring weaknesses in the judicial system, including lenient penalties for domestic violence and loopholes that allowed powerful figures to manipulate the law. For activists and advocates, the trial served as both a milestone and a call to action. It highlighted the need for stronger protections for victims of domestic abuse and harsher penalties for perpetrators. In the weeks following the trial, there were renewed efforts to push for legal reforms in Kazakhstan, with Saltanat's story becoming a symbol of the urgent need for change. The sentence may not have satisfied everyone, but it sent a clear message. Even those with power and privilege are not above the law. Bishimbayev's days of influence and impunity were over, and the world will remember the name Saltanat Nukenova, not just for the tragedy she endured, but for the fight for justice that followed. The tragic death of Saltanat Nukenova exposed deep systemic flaws in Kazakhstan's approach to domestic violence and corruption. Her journey from a strong, independent woman to a victim of control and abuse reflects how societal pressures and a lack of support systems can trap victims in dangerous relationships. This case revealed critical gaps in the legal framework for addressing domestic violence, with lenient penalties and inadequate protections for survivors. It also highlighted how corruption and privilege allow perpetrators to evade accountability. Saltanat's story has become a catalyst for calls to strengthen domestic violence laws, hold the powerful accountable, and create better support systems for victims. While her life was tragically cut short, her legacy can inspire much-needed change, ensuring that no one else suffers the same fate. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more true crime content. Here, we don't just recount the details of a case, we delve deep into the societal systems and failures that allow these tragedies to happen. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on future explorations of high-profile cases that expose corruption, shed light on systemic injustices, and spark vital conversations about change. Together, we can bring attention to these important issues and honor the memories of those like Saltanat, whose stories must never be forgotten. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time as we uncover another story that demands to be told.